be reading a book, my favorite book called Poppy. It's by Avi. Chapter 1, Mr. Ocox. A thin crescent moon, high in the sky, shed faint white light over Dimwood Forest. Stars glowed. Breezes full of ripe summer fragrance floated over nearby meadow and hill. Dimwood itself, veiled in darkness, lay utterly still. At the very edge of this forest stood an old charred oak, on which sat a great horned owl. The owl's name was Mr. Ocox, and he looked like Death himself. Mr. Ocox's eyes, flat upon his face, were round and yellow, with large ebony pupils that enabled him to see as few other creatures could. Moonlight, even faint moonlight, was as good as daylight for him. With his piercing gaze, Mr. Ocox surveyed the lands he called his own, watching for the comings and goings of the creatures he considered his subjects, and his dinners. He looked at Glitter Creek, home to the fish he had found so appetizing, the tar road, across which tasty rabbits were known to hop, Jay's Wood, where many meaty chipmunks sometimes skittered before dawn. By swiveling his head, he searched the marsh for a savory frog, then Newfield, where usually he could count on a delicious vole or two. He looked at Grey House, where Farmer Lamont used to live, then upon the old orchard. He even looked nervously towards Newhouse, but nowhere did he see a thing to eat. Profoundly annoyed, Mr. Ocox was beginning to think he would have no dinner that night. But finally, there, near the top of Baynock Hill, where the ponderous pines had been cut, where only a few struggling saplings and bushes grew, he saw movement. Just the glimmer of food was enough to cause his owl's heart to pound, his curved black beak to clack, his feathered horns to stand up tall. Mr. Ocock shifted his head from right to left, forward and back, and when he did so, he beheld 2 mice. Of all the creatures the owl hunted, he enjoyed mice the most. They were the best eating, to be sure, but better still, they were the most fearful, and Mr. Ocox found deep satisfaction in having others afraid of him. And here, after a wait of nearly the whole night, were 2 savory subjects to terrify before he ate them. One of them, a deer mouse, crouched cautiously beneath the length of rotten bark. The other, a golden mouse, stood in the open on his hind legs, his short tail sticking straight out behind for balance. From his left ear an earring dangled. In his paws he held a hazelnut. "It's not as if I hadn't warned these mice," Mr. Ocox muttered to himself. "If they will move about without my permission, they have only themselves to blame for the consequences." As he leaned forward to listen, his sharp as needle talons, 4 to each large claw and jet black at their tips, cut deeply into the branch he was perched on. "Catching these mice," he mused, "is going to be fun." Now there's a big space between these because we're going to switch perspectives. Right now we're hearing from the perspective of Mr. Ocox, but now we're going to be changing our perspective. See if you can see whose perspective we're listening to now. On Baynock Hill, the golden mouse turned to his timid companion and said, "Poppy girl, this hazelnut is bad to the bone. Bet your seed to sap there's more where it came from. Come on out and dig." "Ragweed," Poppy replied as she sniffed tensely in all directions, "you promised we'd dance when we got here. We can't do it in the open. Besides, I want to answer your questions, so will you please get under here with me?" Ragweed laughed. "Dude, you must think I'm as dull as a dormouse. You just want to get some of this nut." "I don't want any of your precious nut," Poppy insisted. "I want to give you my answer, and I want to dance. Isn't that the reason we came up on the hill? Only it's not safe out there." "Ah, tell me about it." "You heard my father's warnings," Poppy went on. "It's Mr. Ocox. He might be watching and listening." "Get off," Ragweed sneered. "Your pop talks about that Ocox dude to scare you and keep you under control." "Ragweed," Poppy cried, "that's ridiculous. Mr. Ocox does rule Dimwood. So we have to ask his permission to be here, and you know perfectly well we did not." "Dude, I'm not going to spend my life asking an old owl's okay every time I want to have fun. Know what I'm saying? This is our moment, girl, right? And now that I've dug up this nut, I'm going to enjoy it. Besides," he said, It's too dark for an owl to see me." "Poppy," Mr. Ocock scoffed under his breath. "Ragweed. What stupid names mice have! Now if only the deer mice will move a little further out into the under cover, I'll be able to snare both mice at once." The mere thought of such a double catch made Mr. Ocock hiss with pleasure. Then he clacked his beak, spread his wings, and rose up into the night air. Up he circled. He fluttered his flight feathers, beating the air silently. High above Bannock Hill he looked down. The golden mouse, the one eating the nut, was still in the open. So brazen, so foolish. Nevertheless, Mr. Ocock decided to hold back another moment to see if the deer mice might budge. "Ragweed," Poppy pleaded, "please get under here." "Girl," Ragweed said, "do you know what your problem is? You let your tail lead the way." Poppy, hurt and wanting to show that she was not a coward, poked her nose and whiskers out from under the bark. "Ragweed," she persisted even as she began to creep into the open, "being careless is stupid." Her friend took another scrape of the nut and sighed with pleasure. "Poppy," he said, "you may be my best girl, but admit it, you don't know how to live like I do." Poppy took 2 more steps beyond the bark. Just then Mr. Ocock pulled his wings close to his body and plunged, and in an instant he was right above and behind the 2 mice. Once there, he threw out his wings to break his speed, pulled back his head to protect his eyes, and thrust his claws forward like a wide grappling hook to pounce. It was Poppy who saw him. "Ragweed!" she shrieked in terror as she hurled herself back under cover. "It's Ocock's!" But the owl was already upon them. Down came his right claw. It snatched the tip of Poppy's nose. Down came his left claw. It was more successful, clamping around Ragweed's head and neck like a vise of needles, killing him instantly. The next moment the owl soared back into the air. A lifeless ragweed, earring glittering in the moonlight, hung from a claw. As for the hazelnut, it fell to the earth like a cold stone. Powerful but leisurely strokes brought Mr. Ocock back to his watching tree. Once there, he shifted the dead ragweed from talon to beak in one gulp. The mouse disappeared down his throat, earring and all. His hunger momentarily satisfied, Mr. Ocock tilted back his head and let forth a long, triumphant "Hoo! Hoo!" Poppy did not hear the call. In her terror she had fainted. Now she lay unconscious beneath the length of a rotten bark. The owl did not mind. He had enjoyed his first mouse so much that he decided to wait for the second. Indeed, Mr. Ocock was not entirely sorry that Poppy had escaped. She was terrified, and he enjoyed that. And for sure he would get her soon. "Oh yes," he muttered to himself, "mice are the most fun to catch." Then Mr. Ocock did that rare thing for an owl. He smiled.